Yes.
All right. Would you, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to meet you here for our very first online PhD event. We're very excited about it and look forward to sharing some ideas with you about productive writing. Before we begin on the program, we would like to check that everybody can hear us. And we also like you to switch off the video and the sound. So could you just write in the chat function if you can hear my voice, please? It looks very promising.
It does, yeah.
It's full of positivity.
So Jana, would you switch off your camera? Great, thank you.
And Klaus, I will end the polling now.
Yes, right. And you can discuss it with us at a later time. So, good afternoon, everybody. We've been looking forward to doing this event with you on productive writing. I hope you can see the first slide with the Global Denmark team. My name is Klaus, and I'm the Managing Director of Global Denmark that specializes in cross-cultural communication. And over many years, we have conducted numerous courses within research, training, and business. And we work the Copenhagen University on presentation techniques and writing and so on. Enough about me. I was wondering, Ann-Britt, if you could just say a few words about yourself, please.
Yes, I certainly can. Well, as Klaus has just said, my name is Ann-Britt, and I've worked together with Klaus and Mark for almost 20 years. We often work with young researchers and more seasoned researchers. We do a lot of text work, and generally we're just very curious about your communication style.
Great, thank you very much. And Mark?
Yeah, hello there. I'm a consultant at Global Denmark too, surprise, surprise. Has spent the past 20 odd years coaching people on their writing processes, editing people's work, running writing courses, and in fact have been doing a lot of writing myself recently. I'm in the process of completing a book for one of our customers, the Danish Society of Engineers. Yes, so I'm in the depths of a writing process myself at the moment and enjoying it.
Wow, yes. You may even glean some tips from the participants here, Mark.
I usually do. Yes.
Yeah, right. Super. So we are the Global Denmark team here, and we will all be hosting this event. So you will sometimes hear what is almost akin to a conversation between myself and my colleagues, and you can interject remarks and queries through the chat function. And Mark or Ann-Britt will then read your remarks, and we will discuss them at the end of the session, and it will take around 1 hour, thereabouts.
Could
so
I just interject about the chat function there and say that we'll do our best to answer your questions as they come up. We can't promise to answer all questions. Sometimes there's a deluge with these kind of things, but we'll do our very best to deal with all the issues that come up from you.
Right. Super, Mark. And your very best is not bad at all. So that's very promising. Let me just show you briefly what is today's program. We've been keen to see if we can have some ideas about what you would like to get out of this afternoon. I'd like to thank you all who submitted emails to us about what they would like to get out of this session and what they would like to learn from it. And of course, it's an awful lot you want. And this is not a writing course per se. So I hope there will be some ideas and tips and models you can use, and then perhaps join our real courses later on. And I can see there is one more participant coming in here.
Yes.
Welcome to you. Throughout the session, you will hear what we believe is important when we use the term productive writing. Mark said earlier today that he was wondering if productive writing is about churning out a lot of nonsense or if it's something else. So we will discuss this with you. We will also talk about what defines a good text. You can see here, good is in inverted commas, and the reason is that nobody knows what good really is. But if you can have some criteria for what is good, a good text, then we may stand a better chance of actually writing some good texts. We will also move into the area of psychology. How do readers read our texts? How can we possibly identify with our readership? In other words, how can we adapt our texts so that the reader actually understands what we want to convey to him or her? And then we'll round off with some hands-on tips on how to improve your writing. And I was wondering, Anbrit, Mark, have you got anything to add before we move on?
Well, I thought it would be nice to give people an impression of some of our poll results. We can see as of the 26 people that managed to value, I know we're a few more people in the meeting now, but just to give you an idea of who's attending here, we can see that we've got a nice selection of people at various stages in their PhDs. We have a few postdocs with us, and we have the mysterious category of other too. And what's really interesting to see is that in the poll, we can see that people are most concerned about hearing about how to write a good quality research paper without feeling stressed or overwhelmed. So I hope we can move towards that, feeling unstressed and not necessarily underwhelmed by our writing process. And of course, there's the next most popular answer is ways of increasing productivity in
yes.
writing. So what we can see from this is we have shared concerns here.
Yes.
Good.
Great. I will try to integrate this into today's session.
There we go.
Have you got more, Mark?
No.
Okay, so I'll just move this away. Let me just check here. It's important to bear in mind that this is not going to be a 1-hour lecture by me. We will have, as I said before, a kind of conversation with Mark and Anbrit, but there will also be chats and polls interjected in into the program, so you will still have a say as we go along. Let me just move on to what we have called the reader psychology here. There we are. One may wonder who's your target group, and it's perhaps a little more tricky question than one may sort of initially imagine. Who's your target group? Would it be the general public? Would it be colleagues within the same area? Or would it be your supervisor, for example, to keep him or her happy? Sometimes supervisors have ideas and then they change their minds later on, so that can give rise to quite a lot of confusion. And many PhD students discover that they're not really writing to anyone but his or her supervisor, and that is of course problematic. What we say on our academic writing courses is that if you want to have something published, your target group will obviously be the ones who are to assess the quality of your paper and to see if it actually qualifies for publication. In many regards, readers are overwhelmed by their daily workload, and I'm sure you can identify with that too. So it is vital that one has a kind of model where the writer is able to keep the reader interested long enough. That is item number 2 in this slide here: priming, framing, sealing. And what is meant by this is that we need to stimulate the mind to read on. And we also need to set a framework for people to navigate in your text. And finally, when the reading process has been completed, the reader must have a reasonably clear idea as to what your subject was all about. So one may wonder, how do reviewers read? And I've talked to some peer reviewers myself, and it's very clear that, of course, the situations vary an awful lot, but most of them are very busy people. Some may read your text because they're doing someone else a favor. It could be a researcher who doesn't have the time to read your paper and asks a colleague to read the paper instead. That person is not necessarily particularly interested in what you are writing and will be constantly disturbed by emails, telephones, and other PhD students and what have you. What we have found out was that many peer reviewers look at the text first. They check if the title makes sense. It sounds banal, but it isn't. They would also browse through your text to see if your research question is in fact reflected in the discussion. And it's actually before they have properly read the text. I think this is very important to bear in mind, that they will go for structure before content. In the early stages of the reading process, many readers would also do the easy thing first, check for spelling errors, typos, punctuation marks, and so on. And whereas that is not necessarily critical in the final stages, in the early stages, it may well have an impact on how the reader understands not only your text, but also you as a scientist. Because will many typing errors and punctuation errors and so on reflect on you as a scientist? So what is important to bear in mind is that your text is also a manifestation of you as a scientist, and perhaps of you as a person. So what is important, and that's item number 4, is that you are mindful of structure, clarity of your text, also at sentence level, which means that when reading a specific sentence, we should not prompt the reader to reread it to understand it fully. It should be clear enough for the person to read it once. And I was wondering, Mark, you have a tip for how to ensure that a sentence is clear enough for it to be read only once. What's your take?
I have a tip. I have many tips. And
Yes.
one, let's take some of my favorites. First of all, we have a magic word count for sentences, which offends some people, and that is one has to have a very good argument for a sentence to exceed 25 words. So simply keeping the word count down to 25 words, especially if it's the first sentence of an introduction or the first sentence of a paragraph, works well. In the book I've just written, I don't believe there are very many first sentences of paragraphs that are more than 25 words long, because I know how important it is to make a good, clear impact at the start of a paragraph. And every single opening sentence of a paragraph has a strong active voice verb in it. And it just makes it so much easier to read.
And that primes the reader to read on, doesn't it? Yeah. And Britt, when we go through scientific texts, we can almost automatically say, well, some of your sentences are quite long and complex and complicated, can't we?
Absolutely. It's a classic. What I wouldn't get too stuck on the 25 word count. I would more get stuck on how many pieces of information a sentence has. If it's complex information, then I would stay below the 25 word count. But if it's simple information that's easy to digest and remember, you can actually have a sentence that is much longer. So, I mean, there are no, it's always like this. It really depends on the sentence itself.
Yes. So we're back to this principle of priming, framing, and sealing at sentence level. We need to be able to prime the reader to read on. At paragraph level, we also need to prime the reader, make the reader ready for what is to come. And of course, at section level and paper level, it's exactly the same thing. Right. So let us just move on briefly here. We would like we wanted to ask you, what about you? And some of you have sent in some ideas about what they struggle with. We are very grateful for that. And I was wondering, Mark and Ann-Britt, what did we learn from the input we received from our participants here?
That's interesting. If we look at the writer's psychology point of view, let's just get to those here. Some people wrote about a frustration about how long it took to write and to rewrite, and to get what seems like endless feedback and endless requests to rewrite something from a supervisor or a colleague. How to deal with that. What we hear from all of the researchers that we've worked with over the years and other kinds of writers is that it can hurt to have one's words that are written down on paper questioned. Because in effect, when I write something, I'm committing my intellect, my pride to paper. And if somebody starts questioning that, I can feel hurt and offended. So that's an issue to deal with. I have an interesting story from the world of research. And that is a study that's been done of papers that are published in high impact journals. And I often use this on our writing courses, this story. I ask people how many complete rewrites they think a published paper in a high impact journal has been through. Some people say 5, 10. and a number of people get close to the right answer, 16 times a paper has been completely rewritten. The manuscript has been through this rewriting process until it's finally polished off. So I hate to disappoint anybody that would think that they get quicker at writing and speed up their writing process through this seminar, but good writing takes time. And over the years, I've come to accept myself that my words don't matter so much. It's the ideas behind them that matter. And therefore, I've got far happier about rewriting my text many times, because that's how it becomes good.
Yeah. All right. Well, that sounds very interesting, Mark. Right. And I remember when I did some hardcore writing, rewriting my text or rereading my text made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't bear it, and almost got scared of rereading my own rubbish. Became our own enemy in many regards, and I needed some encouragement from someone else. And I also think that psychologically, it's very important that one is on friendly terms with oneself, because exactly. I kept punishing myself, and some of it was very fair, I'm sure, but some of it was not really fair to myself. So I became self-destructive in some regards. Okay. Mark.
Yeah, and that's, we all have different personalities like that. Yeah, I think the basic thing is exactly to keep oneself motivated, and also to accept one's first draft will contain rubbish. And in fact, research into scientific writing has classified this first phase of writing as the rubbish phase. It's where you just get ideas down onto paper, and it needs sorting through, it needs rewriting and restructuring before it becomes a beautiful piece of scientific writing.
Yes.
That hopefully ends up in a high impact journal.
And it's beautiful. I like that word. It's a work of art.
Other comments from people included how to keep the momentum and the motivation up in my writing process. This is a typical issue for people, for all of us who write professionally, keeping the momentum up. And we have some answers to how to keep the motivation and momentum up later on. Yes.
But to round this part off, I hope you can see that the previous slide was about reader psychology, that we need to keep their spirits up to read our text properly. And as writers, we also need to keep spirits up to conduct a productive writing process. And this is where a simple model like priming, framing, and sealing might be a way in which we can encourage ourselves to write a little more efficiently too.
Could I just add one thing there?
Yes, I knew you would.
Because in relation to this your point here, priming, framing, sealing, several people wrote into us that they were concerned about how to express complex ideas in a simple way, doing justice to the complexity of the scientific concepts and yet getting it across to the reader in a way that was readable. And when you as a writer are thinking like that, wow, these are complex ideas, they're beautiful scientific concepts, but I've got to get them across simply. Well, that's exactly what you do. One bit of a concept at a time in one sentence, and then another sentence for the next part of the concept. So you introduce the general structure of the concept and then move gradually into the details. Again, back to your point, Klaus.
And we're back to the psychological navigation in the text, both as readers and as writers, which brings me on to exactly that point. One can say that in order to explain something very complex, we may use some very simple tools. And many people say, well, writing is not necessarily rocket science. I would certainly say that it is rocket science. It is complex. It is difficult, but there are some simple tools that make this possible. And one such tool is understanding the 4 key elements of effective writing. And some of our previous students will remember this, I hope. The first one is stimulation. That is an external factor that somehow keeps the optimism of the reader going for long enough to actually read the text properly. The second one is inspiration. That is an internal cognitive process, something that inspires us, something that adds spirit to the reading process. We start thinking. So stimulation is an external factor, and I'll get back to this momentarily. And the inspiration factor is what keeps us going. And one may say, if when you read a text and you say, wow, I never thought about that before, or wow, I think I've seen this before, you're being inspired by the text. If you say to yourself, I don't understand a word of what this text is about, I'm bored stiff, and I wish I could do something else. Maybe I should have that cup of tea. And if that is your thinking, you are not made to think and link, all right? This is very pretty, perhaps building the relevance bridge. And what we mean by this is exactly what Mark was talking about, namely, how can we make sure that there is some sort of link between what I would like to get out of the text and what is in fact presented to me. Again, it sounds easy, and of course, it's quite tricky. The third element is information, and that is the very reason for you doing your writing, isn't it? We don't do it for fun. We don't do it just to pass the time. There is a reason for it, your data, your results. And in order for the information element to work here, it is important that the reader is able to navigate in the text. And that's also why an academic text is very often structured in a very foreseeable, predictable way. So we know where we are. We already have a formal framework. We already have a roadmap to follow. Or rather, if we don't have it, we are at risk of not being read properly. We're back to the complexity of things. Why do researchers and students often compress the information element into our texts? And I would personally have the audacity as a 66-year-old man to say that one of the reasons, and it's fully justifiable in my way, is for the young student to impress the world. I want to tell the full story, and I want to show the world that I master all the information necessary. But sometimes it's not necessarily necessary for that particular text. This is where we need to be able to cut painfully sometimes, to adjust and trim the text so the information element doesn't overwhelm the stimulation and the inspiration elements. Then next, of course, education. Education it builds on a Latin expression ex duco, which means that we bring people from one stage to the next. And if I, the publisher, am brought to a higher stage, your text is accepted. Your text has made the difference necessary for my journal to publish it. And isn't that what we want to achieve? So just bear in mind, we have these 4 simple phases: stimulation and inspiration, without which the information may not be understood properly. And then the ultimate goal is bringing our readers to another and higher state of knowledge. I'd just like to give you an example of this. This is not an academic writing course. You just get one example here. Look at this. How about that? It's an authentic text, but without reading it, I become pessimistic about it. I am destimulated because I simply see a lot of words and no breathing space, no ways in which I can sit back and digest the information. And this all happens before I have read the text. And just to follow up on what Mark said before, look at this. This is exactly the same text, but I have divided it into simple paragraphs, each paragraph having one main idea. And then we can move on to the next paragraph by having a good priming sentence to link it up to the other paragraphs. Without reading the text, I hope you can see that, hey, I become a little more optimistic about this because the reading becomes more manageable because I've divided the text into paragraphs. When you finalize the editing process, you may break it up into more paragraphs, or you may put paragraphs together. But the point is, in your writing, make sure that your paragraphs are extremely short for you as a writer to be able to navigate in your own thoughts. So that would be one of our tips here. Have you got anything to add, Andrew, to Mark?
Mark just indicated.
Yeah, I'd like to say something here. Yes, paragraphs are wonderful for readers. They're also a wonderful way to de-stress your writing process. If you think about dividing your writing process into manageable parts, think about writing paragraphs. Write your scientific paper paragraph by paragraph, not page by page, not section by section, but a paragraph at a time. It makes everything so much more manageable. So it's also a wonderful writing process tool,
yes.
Paragraphing.
This is what we on our courses call writer's optimism. Hey, there is a way out of this. This is a mission possible. Right? Let me just move on to some very simple hands-on writing strategies. And I can already now say that some of the tips we are offering you here may work with you, hopefully, and others won't, because it's a strictly personal affair. So take these ideas with a pinch of salt. We have based our tips on our own self-experienced knowledge about this, and of course we also read about it in the literature, and we've learned a lot from people like your good selves when going through your texts on our courses and so on. So let us just take the first set of writing tools we have here. The first one is unfair, isn't it? Of course, we should all be angels and saints and start early and write regularly, and that is exactly what many people fail to do, and I can humbly include myself. I always start a bit late, and I don't write regularly because I don't think I have any ideas about this. Whatever I have to embark on the writing process, I have to start from scratch almost. So our first tip is, painful as it sounds, start early. It doesn't have to be deep. It doesn't have to be particularly acceptable, but just start the writing as a routine and do it regularly, or else it won't be a routine. It doesn't have to be pretty. You just have to do it. Another tool would be that you have the outline rather than, as I often do, sadly, I often start writing the body text, then I reorganize it to make it look nice and well structured. But our tip is that you draft an outline, and it can be extremely simple. You simply first give the sections some sort of title, some headlines, and you give them level 1 priority in your word processor. And suddenly you'll see that even if you don't have the text, you have a framework for it. Some people become quite optimistic about this. I've actually produced something that smacks of an academic text. Rather than 10 pages of densely written text, you have to reorganize at a later time. The next phase we recommend is that once you have made the headlines, you generate a table of contents, and it can be done automatically in the word processor. And in so doing, you will see, as you're writing underneath the various headlines, that your text is graphically evolving. You can see you actually generating a product and not just merely text. And this will help you ensure that you have a sufficiently stringent structure in your text. There's no guarantee, but there is some help here. And finally, when you update the table of contents regularly, you have one page where you can see that you've actually produced something, so you can avoid that self-destructive negativity we often have when we think about our own writing. That's why we call it writer's optimism. And you know, this is not rocket science. It's very down to earth, but I think that I'm not the only one who makes the error of doing it in a completely different way, and I waste a lot of time and a lot of optimism in the process. So I stand to learn from our own tips here. Mark.
Could I, Avi, I completely agree with you here.
You better.
Too, surprisingly enough. Actually, I've just written this, I keep saying it, but I've just written this book. And because it was a book I was writing for someone else, it was for a customer, I really had a lot of project management to do here, because there were other people relying on me and who had to approve the text. Not only that, it was a product somebody was paying for, so I had to produce a synopsis, a detailed outline of what I was to write for each chapter. And by goodness me, it made it easy to write, because I simply had the complete structure for the book and for the chapters, which of course changed a little during the writing process, as I actually became more efficient in the way I could express ideas and tell the story of this organization. But I remember that feeling I had when I'd done the book outline chapter by chapter, and I'd also done a detailed 3-month plan for the process. I simply felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. And instead of being frightened and stressed about the project, I started really enjoying it and working very efficiently. It was wonderful. So a detailed project plan and a detailed outline, which was still at a general structural level, really helped me.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce you to a happy writer, which is very encouraging.
And by the way, I say all this, I suffer from writer's block terribly. I'm terrible. You can ask Klaus the number of times Klaus has asked me to write things at Global Denmark, and I've delayed the project for months or not done it. Using these tips here that we're using here helps somebody who suffers chronically from writer's block be very productive.
Yeah. And this is a very nice cue for me to go on, Mark, because if you suffer from writer's block, we recommend that you engage in what we call shameless writing. That is, rather than constantly thinking about you not being able to write anything. And we heard from some of your comments that that is in fact an issue here. I have nothing to write, therefore I don't write. Or I don't think my ideas are bright enough to deserve any writing, for which reason I don't write. Don't do that. Write shamelessly. Lots of nonsense. Nobody needs to see it, except you may imagine that you're writing to someone who has no idea about what you are dealing with. And I call her Auntie Agatha. Write to her, don't send it off to her necessarily, but write to her about why you can't write. And in many cases, you will discover, hey, something is beginning to happen in my mind and in my text. I've personally done this several times, and it became a surprisingly good text, at least for myself. And I became more encouraged to write low quality, but I did some writing here. And gradually it evolved into something acceptable. The next thing, and this is where I have benefited a lot from our own tips here. When I submitted my master's thesis back in 1981, I was praised for the originality of my subject. I was praised for my knowledge about the literature and so on. And then the referees spent a full page on leveling scathing criticism and the messiness of my text, the patchwork style I had employed, and all those brilliant ideas that really had no bearing on my sort of academic line of thought, turned out not to be very brilliant because they were not really relevant in this text. So what I learned and later on in life taught others to do was to make headlines for each and every paragraph you write. And then once you've written the paragraph, you can delete the headline. Which also brings me on to the next phase, which is more, it's wonderfully digital in many regards. Always write your research question in the header of the page. So whenever you embark on a new page, your research question will come up for you as a writer. Delete it afterwards, but make sure that your research question actually permeates the entire text. That is exactly what I was criticized for then, and that is exactly what I also see many peer reviewers criticized for. That is when they cannot see the research question properly reflected in the discussion and in the conclusion. And it's very often because creative people, undisciplined people like myself, get brilliant ideas on the way, and they may be brilliant, but they are irrelevant for the text. You can hear that I'm speaking as a bitter man here because I was really criticized for this, and I shall never forget this. But it was a learning process. Ann-Britt?
Well, I was just reminded of a paper that you and I worked on, Klaus. The author submitted it to us and asked us to have a look at it, and she said, I need to reduce this by 50%. And we read through it and we said, well, you've got 2 or 3 papers here. And that was exactly that she had lost track of what she was supposed to be doing. And she just kept on piling on and piling off. So all of a sudden she said, oh, that's right. I can split this up into 2 or 3 papers. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So it all boils down to stringency of structure and economizing on the volume of information you want to squeeze into the text. And what happened there was that she managed to get 3 papers out of 1, in a sense. Right. I can see from Mark's keen face that he has something to say here.
we have one more poll that it might be interesting for
Yes.
people to look at if we have time here, and it's all about it's a double-edged sword in a good way. The poll in itself shares some tips for you, but it's also a survey of how you personally as writers think about creating a productive writing environment for yourselves, your optimal writing environment. So what we'd like you to do is to just tick off. I'll share the poll with you here now. And let me just get it up on the screen for you. Launch polling. Could you just quickly, we'll just give you a minute to tick off your 4 favorite items that enhance your writing process. So let's just take a minute to answer that. Start clicking away now. And I can see 5 of 32 people have answered. 10, 11. Wow, it's going quickly now.
Yeah.
There we go. Right, and that's a minute and a half of the minute I promised you. So I'll end the polling now, and let's just share these results on screen. Wow, look. So what seems to be important here is knowing what is your most productive time of day or night, and that would imply that we then need to create space at that productive time for ourselves. And a very good way of doing that is one of the tips and one of the more popular answers here to scheduling writing slots in my calendar. This is what I do and what we do at Global Denmark. If we need time to write or do some other kind of creative work, we block the time out in our calendar so people can see that. And again, we need to talk about our ideas with colleagues and friends, many of us, to develop ideas or to create space alone. And it's very nice to see that many people have turning off mobile phone, disabling desktop notifications as a key to, and this is a real modern problem, all of these disturbances, because we know that if we're in a flow, in a state of mind where we've been creative, developing ideas, and that process gets interrupted, it can take half an hour, an hour to get back into that state of mind. So it's so important to create this undisturbed environment and to prioritize it. Yes.
What is also interesting is that in the world of psychology, we sometimes use the this term, I'm sure you all know, flow, when you lose a sense of time and a place. And once that process is over, you have this euphoric sense, almost a joyous sense. Wow, that was something you got. You're almost like a rush of a sorts, which is a very, very important experience to have, because that means that you have managed to delve into your writing without being disturbed by other things. Make that possible for you and make it physically possible for you.
There you go. And it's just to round this point off, it's so important to think about, how do I optimize my writing process? How do I take responsibility for creating a good space for myself to work in? Who do I need to talk to sort that out? Good.
Right, super.
Over to you, Klaus.
Thank you. The next slide will show you some difficult aspects about how we personally deal with our writing process and how we can make it easier. And again, it looks trivial, but why do we always have to bring it up? Maybe it's not that trivial after all. The first thing is, you have to ask yourself this terribly painful question: what I'm writing about now, is that really necessary for my paper? If you hesitate, you should very likely delete it or place it somewhere else. If you say, well, this is necessary because blah, 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 you stand a very good chance of have a qualified discussion with your supervisor about the relevance of it. But you need to ask yourself this question before the supervisor does. The next aspect is how we can keep ourselves optimistic. And not every section in an academic paper is equally difficult or easy. And when I write easy, it's because, of course, it's not necessarily easy as such, but many people are well advised to do a more mechanical section before the more intellectually difficult ones. And here we are thinking about the materials and methods section, which is basically a kind of checklist you are writing to ensure that your academic setup is reproducible. So do the more mechanical things first, very much like the peer reviewer who checks for typing errors and punctuation mistakes and so on before actually engaging in the reading proper. So there are so many similarities between reading and writing, and we can learn from both worlds. The third idea is a very simple and very, very effective way of checking the quality of a text. Read it aloud. You may not necessarily be absolutely and totally fluent in the language in which you're writing your text, but the vast majority of you will be able to detect where the text becomes unmusical, unnecessarily long, unnecessarily difficult to navigate in, and so on. Reading aloud a text is a great quality assurance tool. And Andrit, we use this at Global Denmark, don't we?
We certainly do. It's part of our quality assurance when we do translation work. Two people sit together and read the text aloud, simply to listen out for the musicality. Does this flow the way it's supposed to flow? Does this sound natural? Yes. Do I stumble? Do I need some punctuation here, and so on?
And what is interesting too is that whereas we build our careers at Global Denmark on optimism and finding the strengths in things, we can say that if you think that this text sounds odd or incorrect, it very likely is odd or incorrect. So here we can use negativity as a positive tool in many regards. So be suspicious if the text doesn't sound right to you, some work needs to be done on it. Conversely, if the text sounds great to you, it may not necessarily be that great. That's the sad aspect of it. But reading aloud a text puts the text into a completely different conceptual framework, namely our cognitive faculties we don't always use when actually reading. It's a different a cognitive faculty. You can also use some robot readers to do it for you. It's not necessarily pretty, but a robotic reading facility, as you have in Microsoft Word and so on, can also help you detect when a sentence seems to be a bit too long or too complicated to understand when you actually hear it from a voice. So read the text aloud and listen to the musicality of it, check for omissions, and check for unnecessary complexity. And I can hear from Mark's breathing that he wants to say something.
No, that's satisfied. The satisfied breathing of agreement, Klaus.
Okay. And then something that perhaps sounds silly, when you have a quota, when you set yourself a quota to achieve, once you've done it, reward yourself. Buy that pair of jeans, get that cup of tea, go for that walk, and so on. But don't do it before you've actually reached your target. It sounds silly, but this is a way of keeping up morale, discipline, and also your optimism.
Klaus,
Mark.
perhaps you could take us to our 5 tips now on slide 14. Because we are hitting the half-past mark.
Indeed we are.
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. It was slide 14, you'd say. The 5 tips. Okay, so we've tried to prime you for what is going to happen. We've also been working on framing what this session was all about, and now it comes to the sealing process. And these are our 5 essential tips. The first one is start early and write regularly. Keep this as an integrated part of your professional life. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, there are researchers who can churn out one article after the other. They are not necessarily geniuses. They're not necessarily workaholics, but they write regularly and they start early. Sometimes they cheat too, that's true, but that's a different story. Draft the outline before you embark on the body text. Write the headlines so you have the structure in place before you start becoming too creative. And you heard about this table of contents. When you have this structure, which is exemplified in the table of contents, you have something to fill in, not necessarily create, but to fill in, and it becomes a little more mechanical, and you can use your resources for actually generating the great ideas because the structure is in place. That will also greatly improve your benefits from talking to your supervisors about this once the structure is correct. We have met many supervisors, and me too, who recommend that you do something different from what you actually wrote. When you then eventually do write what they ask for, they say, oh, I've changed my mind. The first version was in fact better. And it's very often because the structure is unclear. Give yourself a quota every single day. It doesn't have to be brilliant. It doesn't have to be pretty, but it's got to be a routine. And then finally, be good to yourselves and think kindly about your own work. The inner optimism is what generates writer's optimism. So these were our key points here. We will send you the recording of the whole thing here. And if you have any comments, we are ready to read in the chat section. If you have any queries and so on, we will make an effort to answer them. So we will stay online for the next 10, 15 minutes or so. But I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we can keep in touch one way or the other. Also like to thank Mark and Andret for cooperating with me about this. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.